welcome to the Theology Pugcast. We're glad you're with us. I am not C.R. Wiley. He is not able to join us this week. I am Glenn Sunshine. I'm a senior fellow at the Colson Center for Christian Worldview, a ministry associated at Reflections Ministries, and I have my own ministry called Every Square Inch Ministries. And that's about it for me. Tom, why don't you introduce yourself and our guest?
All right, I am Tom Price. I teach systematic theology, theological ethics, philosophy, and a few other things. One of the places is Gordon Conwell Theological Seminary. And today we have a special guest, Dr. Jahdiel Perez. We have been back and forth through the years, but never even met virtually like this. So this is a real treat for us. And I'm going to let him introduce himself and kind of what area of study he is. But this has to do with one of our favorite topics, C.S. Lewis. So take it away, Jahdiel.
Well, first of all, I'm really happy to be with you all. Thank you for having me here. I'm a big C.S. Lewis guy. There's two guys that have been really central to my thinking and life. One is C.S. Lewis. The other is Friedrich Nietzsche. Not exactly the pairing that we would normally have. But I did philosophy at UMass Boston. I fell in love with it. It raised all these big questions that I thought, how could I possibly ignore these questions? I really just want to dedicate my life to kind of exploring them. And then I describe it that I got seduced by theology. So I went to Harvard Divinity School to kind of study theology. I went there specifically because I didn't want to study with people that already agreed with my, with my view of faith. So I love that in every classroom, nobody agreed with me on a wide range of topics, and it was really fun to be able to engage different perspectives. And then, the latest kind of phase, I went to the University of Oxford to study C.S. Lewis, and it was just a dream come true. I was able to write the first theology dissertation on C.S. Lewis since his death, which is, we could talk about that a little bit, because you would expect Oxford to have done this a little sooner. There had been one done previously from the English department, but this was the first with a more theological focus. And it's really interesting because Americans were writing on C.S. Lewis while he was alive, So, but yeah, after Oxford, God opened the doors to be a postdoc at Villanova University. And I was really fortunate to transition that into a longer tenure track job in humanities and the sciences. So that's where I'm at now. And I'm just really happy to be here.
Yeah, congratulations on that new job title. That's very exciting. There's a lot of things that are worth unpacking, but I think a really good way into it is something you sent me. I think is the last topic, and maybe that'll help us get into the topic of your dissertation. But C.S. Lewis as a theologian. A lot of people know him as an apologist or sort of someone who engaged in kind of, cultural analysis and the way in which Christianity could provide a distinct way of communicating itself in that environment. But a lot of people don't realize how theologically astute Lewis was. And maybe you kind of want to unpack that a little for our audience?
Yeah, so this is really a fascinating question. If anybody wants to follow up on these ideas, I recently published an article with the Heathrop Journal exploring this exact topic. So while C.S. Lewis was alive, he was not seen as a theologian at all. So he never studied theology. He never taught theology. And yet he ends up writing some of the best-selling, most impactful theology books that we know today. So it really cost him professionally. So I don't know if you're aware, but Oxford University never offered him a full professorship, even though he was very distinguished among the faculty. And part of the reason was they thought, well, how serious of a scholar can he be if he's writing The Problem of Pain, Screw Tape Letters, Mere Christianity? He's not a theologian. Why is he doing this? So it cost him professional career opportunities, but that he felt that was his calling. That's what God had called him to do, to fill in this gap. So while he was alive, nobody really respected him as a theological writer. And then in the decades after, you start to see that Oxford keeps denigrating him. So even in the way that some textbooks are written, you'll be very hard pressed to find him as even a conservative, an evangelical, any stripe of theologian. He's not really categorized under that heading specifically. Fortunately, about 12, 15 years ago, there's been this trend where serious theologians like N.T. Wright, Alistair McGrath, Rowan Williams have started to take Lewis's theological insights more seriously. And that has opened up a gateway for other theologians to take his writings theologically generative, right? And I hope to be one of them. So, I think it's really exciting that people are appreciating his insights a little bit more. And just to summarize the argument, and Alistair McGrath makes this argument really well. It's not really up to you sometimes what you're categorized as, you know? Yeah. Like you could want to be a poet, right? You could say, I'm going to be a poet. I'm going to work really hard as a poet. But if there's no community that recognizes or affirms you as a poet, all things considered, you're probably not going to be a poet. Yeah. Something similar happened with Lewis, where even though he didn't think he was a real or serious theologian, I mean, there's like countless people around the world, countless communities that see him as a theological voice and guide. So I think it's safe to say that even though during his life and in the decades shortly after, he wasn't given that kind of respect as a theologian, now, as you can see with me, you can go to Oxford University and write a theology doctorate on him, which is really exciting.
I think one of the things that is interesting here, and I think one of the reasons why Lewis ends up being really an original theological thinker in a lot of ways, within the broad span of orthodoxy, is that he wasn't trained as a theologian. The very fact that he was trained as a philosopher, but also as a literature scholar, literary scholar, and as a poet, all of these things, I think, give him a different perspective, a different angle on theology, so that he's not thinking the way a traditional theologian will think. And I think that helps. I think that helps him, in a sense, come at it from a different direction. I think that is an important component of what makes his work important and original, as within the realm of theology.
It's a great insight, and part of what I go to in the article I mentioned that I published recently is there are some drawbacks to doing theology professionally. Yeah. And Lewis, in volume 2 of his letters, he writes to a friend inquiring. The friend is considering, hey, I'm thinking about switching from history to theology professionally. And his name is Sheldon Van Auken. He wrote the book A Severe Mercy. And Lewis warns him and says, listen, there's actual benefits to not doing theology professionally, to keep on with what he calls your tent making, referencing St. Paul's profession according to tradition. And it's really interesting. So it's not always, being a professional theologian can be a calling, but there are some risks associated with just making something sacred ordinary and everyday, right? And I think that speaks to, Glenn, what you were saying, that Lewis came from a very unique and special angle to some of these subjects.
And I think I do theology for a living, and I get exactly what you're saying. There is also a very, I think Glenn disappeared for a minute. He'll be back. But I think one of the things that is interesting is studying academic theology, you tend to get locked into schools of thought. It's very easy to do. I know when I was coming through, you tended to have, especially in Oxford, you tend to have very strong schools of thought. You had your Bardians. I was sort of in that camp back in that day. And I don't recall anyone really being, studying Lewis on that level. And Lewis tended to be seen as, like you said, someone who was, a lay thinker and didn't have anything serious to commit. And it was actually through the changing of my own theology as I drew deeper into the fathers, into the medieval period, and I understood, I guess, especially from Augustine and different figures, a fuller vision of the Christian faith rather than the kind of schools of thought I was trained into as kind of a young evangelical, if you will. That made me aware of things in Lewis that showed me how profound and deep he actually was as a thinker, where it was really my shallowness and my academic training that was limited. When I was actually broadened, it opened a world into which, I'll give you an example, the discarded image. The metaphysical implications of what he's talking about there have not even been scratched by most theologians. And I think right in that terrain is where that big vacuum that has been missing in a lot of modern evangelical thought can actually be can find resources for addressing issues that are problems today. Anyway, I unpacked a mouthful, so I'll let you respond to that.
Well, I think that's a great insight. Several changes have happened in the world of theology that paved the way for Lewis. I think that's what you're picking up on. One of them is a turn to narrative, the importance of narrative, the importance of not overemphasizing our reasoning capabilities and having a more holistic view of the human being, right? So when if you think that imagination, that embodiment is really important, that it's not just this subordinate issue, that opens up a way now to more imaginative approaches to theological questions. So there's different developments that have happened. Even some insights from postmodernism as well has kind of opened a way and made space for Lewis to be valued as a theological thinker. One of the ideas that I'm working out at the moment is there's this concept that psychologists use called face validity. And the idea is something like this. You could have very abstract concepts. If you want to measure them, and let's say you want to put together like a questionnaire or a survey, you could translate from your expertise onto the survey, hand it out to the ordinary person that you're trying to collect data from, and they could be completely lost and have no idea what you're talking about. And maybe both of you think you're talking about God, when in reality, there's a huge disconnect. So what some social scientists speak about is face validity, right? Does an idea have meaning for ordinary people out in the actual world? I think this is a beautiful lens to appreciate what Lewis can do for theologians, academic theologians, right? Lewis has quite a bit of face validity, right? He's read by so many different people, lay persons. He's very accessible. And I think part of what he can help us do is to test out how facially valid are some of the ideas that theologians operate with.
Yeah, that's very rich. I think one of the things that really shifted some years back in my own thinking that connects with this and Lewis on this was especially a much richer view of the doctrine of creation. When I started to unpack sort of the doctrine of God more fully and see the implications for the doctrine of creation and the metaphysics of creation in particular, the way in which the reality of creation, of course, is open by nature to its creator. And that means it's kind of a meaning-filled world oriented towards God when it's ordered the right way. And so Lewis is able to capture this and bring it into that ordinary sense in which even fallen humanity in their ordinary lives are part of a meaning-filled and directed world. It's one that is reaching out on the rational level, but on the aesthetic level. And this is where I think that imaginative and that way of connecting with these desires in people. And I think this ties into something else you had mentioned, this notion of joy, right? The notion of something about our human constitution as creatures is oriented towards the joy that God is. And this is filled everywhere in all of our attempts to satiate that happiness or joy in all of these different places of looking for creaturely meaning, right? Lewis will often talk about the sweet poison of, the false infinite, that there is this kind of joy that we find in all of these God substitutes because creation is meaningful and it does have something in it that draws us to it. But when we get that balance off, we somehow, we kind of get locked into the creaturely and lose the real infinite. But I think what you're saying here is that world of meaning and that ordinary sense is something Lewis was able to communicate those rich things into. Am I on the right track?
Yeah, I think the question of, you're centering on the question of meaning, and that's what
Yeah.
we're really talking about, right?
Yeah.
Because I think that the Enlightenment project was so focused on like truth and metaphysics and
Yeah.
epistemology and all these high abstract concepts
Yeah.
that it just lost meaning for the ordinary individual, right?
Yeah.
And Lewis felt like, listen, who is reaching out to them? Who is
Yeah.
speaking their language?
Yeah.
Nobody. And
Yeah.
that's why he tells his friend, Austin Farrer, a very respected Oxford theologian,
Yeah. Yeah.
and he writes a letter saying, listen, if Austin had just spoken the ordinary language of people, there would have been no need for a C.S. Lewis, he said. Right? There would have just been no need. But since nobody's doing it, he's stepping in. And I think that role of a translator is
Yeah.
very important and very
Yeah.
necessary, and has to be done anew every generation, right?
Yeah.
Every generation, there has to be somebody that's willing to stand in the gap and reconnect these two worlds, the world of
Yeah.
professional academic theology and the world of the lived, experiential, everyday theology.
And it takes a special gift. I mean, it's been. I mean, like I said, the abstract stuff comes very easy to my kind of thinking. The translating it, I have to read a Lewis to be able to figure out ways of communicating it. And as a teacher, you're trying to do this all the time because your students don't come in with the vocabulary, and so you want to share those rich things and have them run with something. But it's hard to make that connect. So I think you're right on, and I think a lot of people avoid reading, theology of the fathers or anything else because they fear it's going to be like the logarithms of, modern academic theology, right? And it can often be. It's interesting you mentioned Farrer. Farrer was actually the chaplain at my college, St. Edmund Hall in Oxford, long before I was there. So I always found that quite fascinating. But he wrote a book, I think it was something infinite, finite in the infinite, or something. The title itself would turn you off. It would never draw you in. So Lewis was right on with that.
That's it. Yeah, that's fascinating. Yeah, that's a really good, great point.
Yeah. Now, he was very close friends with Farrer. Am I correct? Is he was they were pretty regular in terms of their friendship.
Yeah, I think Farrer was up there with Tolkien, and they would hang out and correspond quite a bit. Lewis was also close friends with his wife Catherine, and then when Lewis got married, his wife was close friends also with Catherine. So they were kind of two power couples that would often correspond and hang out while she was of course alive. She passed away very shortly after they got married. But they were pretty close friends.
Yeah, that's fascinating because that's exactly. I mean, that's the kind of high-end academic theology of that day, and very conceptual and rigorous. And yet Lewis, I think, many times took the rich threads that you find in Farrer, was able to actually give it life to everyone else. That's great. So with this whole notion of meaning and the ordinary, how does Lewis's literary gift play into communicating that? I mean, I think that's one of the things he really has, is such a rich use of language and communication, and this actually serves his theological interests in ways that maybe someone without that wrestles with.
Yeah, that's a great question. Let me just say two things to respond to it. The first is Lewis did not denigrate Farrer's work. So he thinks that they're both important. They're really both important. The high academic abstract thinking and the more engaged, accessible kind of writing. I think part of a temptation that we may face today is that what I'm doing is the most important thing. And if you're not doing what I'm doing, you're part of the problem. You should be doing what I'm doing. And what I find so refreshing about Lewis is that he said, no, there are many different important roles and jobs. Farrer's doing very valuable work. We need breakthroughs and developments at the abstract level, but also we cannot forget about ordinary language. So I think that the first thing is to say that it's not to denigrate Farrer or his theology. It's to say that they're both very important. The second thing about his literary talents is I wish, I want to challenge the listeners, right? Especially if you haven't studied creative writing. I haven't studied creative writing, but just try to write a short story. Just try.
Yeah.
Short. It could be just like 1 page or 2 pages, 5 pages, whatever. If you're anything like me, it will be extremely difficult,
Yeah.
really hard.
Yeah.
And I've spent years poring over Lewis's writings, but it is so difficult to write a good, well-crafted, convincing, gripping story. And the fact that Lewis was able to do so naturally, easily, speaks to some kind of genius that he had. So one of the infuriating bits of information about Lewis is that, and I tell my students this, that he wrote his first Christian book, The Pilgrim's Regress, right after his conversion.
Yeah.
He wrote it when he went on a 2-week holiday to Ireland with his friend Arthur, which is infuriating. Like it's like a 300-page book almost.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I'm like, bro, how can you go on vacation and write this? Like, this is what you do for vacation. And it's a very well told story.
Yeah.
But clearly he was gifted. Clearly his father saw some of his gifting, allowed him to train with William Kirkpatrick, set him up for success. So a lot of it, I think, is not just Lewis, but his support network, the opportunities he was given. A lot of it's natural for him. But that's to say that it's really difficult to do what he did. And I don't expect anyone to pick up where he left off, right? I don't know if there will be. I hope that there will be another person like Lewis.
Yeah.
But I don't know if there will be. I feel like God might be calling different people with different skill sets to do slightly different things.
Yeah.
But part of his talent was natural, part of it was social, and a lot of it was he just practiced it, and being able to do that, coming from poetry, coming from creative writing, where metaphors are so important, he was able to think, what are the images that will capture the imagination of my audience at this specific time, right? Yeah. And that's why when you read Mere Christianity, if you pay attention to the imagery, a lot of it's drawn from war, right? Because he's given these lectures during World War II, right? So he talks about these bomb craters. He talks about civil rebellion. He talks about advancing. He uses a lot of militaristic images. Yeah. But he knows these are the images that are going to capture the imagination of his audience. So that's one practical tip that maybe we could take away from the way that he communicated.
Yeah, very, very insightful and rich there. And, when you were talking about it, it reminded me of something, that kind of different level of his giftedness that I think a lot of times get missed when we recognize that here is somebody who can communicate so richly and bring people into the moment with the kind of imagery that's captivating. But here's another thing is he went against the grain of a lot of thinking, even fashionable theology of its time, by not losing the heart of sort of the rich Christian thread, historic Christian thread that he kind of came into from a variety of different angles. I'll give you an example. You often talk about in The Discarded Image, the way in which the medieval Christian mindset was integrative, the way in which things that most systems would have pushed out, it found a way of ordering within. In a lot of ways, his theological and philosophical thinking is that way. He's not someone who jettisoned reason when kind of that was fashionable, or he's not someone who threw it on the pedestal and made it everything when kind of imagination and experience were seen as not fashionable. He was someone who integrated these things and stuck to that integration. And similar with natural theology in a way, but not in a way of doing it the way moderns did, but much more the way classic Christian thinkers did as part of this whole participatory vision. What do you think of that? I mean, was that something that was at the forefront of just his shaping as someone who knew the Renaissance and medieval thought? Or this was something that he really found needed to be held to, even in a world that had shifted from it in theology.
Yeah, I think that's a wonderful insight and a great question. So I'll just respond in two ways. The first is to draw on, so Michael Ward edited this book called, it's about heresies and how to find them, right?
Yeah.
The rule of heresies. And something that he notes, and I just hadn't picked up on, is how heresies actually are very rational and they make quite a bit of sense, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
To say that Jesus was either fully human and it was just an exceptional human being, that makes a lot of sense, right? Like that's very rational. To think actually he was just a spirit and his body was kind of a manifestation, but he's God, right? So how could he possibly inhabit a body? Well, that kind of makes sense too when you think about it.
Yeah.
But orthodoxy chose the difficult balancing act of saying we're not going to choose either option. We're going to try to hold both in tension, right? He was both fully human being, fully God.
Yeah.
So that insight really allowed me to appreciate how orthodoxy itself, mere Christianity itself, is kind of a both and, right? It's not this easy reductive either or. It's kind of a both and. Let's try to hold that tension together. I think that's the first thing I'd say. The second is that my dissertation was exactly on what you're talking about, which is integration on Lewis's in Lewis's writing. And what I looked at specifically was it seemed to me like Lewis was holding in tension joy and sorrow, right? Tragedy and comedy, right? And what's really fascinating is that especially coming after the Second World War, many theologians and philosophers adopted a tragic philosophy of life. They said, how could we possibly be joyful anymore after we've been hit by these horrendous sufferings, right? We need to avoid this. We need to learn how to cope with it. And in order to do that, we need to dive into the tragedies. We need to look at Job as our example, as Oedipus as our example. We need to live and think along tragic lines, right? And then roughly in the 70s and 80s, there was a kind of counterbalance, which was no, right? Which was we're way too tragic. We're way too sad. We need to reaffirm. We need to recollect and retrieve laughter and joy. And part of the reason is according to my view, is because someone like Nietzsche shows, what is at stake in the question of joy, right? So one of his main texts is called the Fruchtliche Wissenschaft, right? The joyful science. And the idea is something like, if you really want to be joyful and life affirming, be an atheist. Right? Be an atheist. That's the joyful, life affirming philosophy, right? And it comes to mind. What comes to mind is Charles Swinburne's famous line from his hymn to Persephone, when he says, "Thou hast conquered, O pale Galilean, the world has grown gray from thy breath." Right? The idea being that, man, we used to have so much joy when the pagan gods reigned, when we had Saturnalia and all these different festivals and drunkenness and orgies. Like life was so colorful. And then this pale Galilean came along and ruined all the fun.
Ruined
it, So Nietzsche's point is something like, yes, there's something deeply joy-denying and life-denying in Christianity. And if you want to properly be joyful, you have to be an anti-theist or an atheist, right? So with that insight in mind, there were a wave of theologians that said we need to respond to Nietzsche and actually reaffirm forcefully that Christianity is a joyful, is a comic kind of way of thinking, way of living. And what my work did in my dissertation is looking at Lewis as someone who integrates both, right? Going back to your point of integration. That's not just, okay, there's joy and laughter, but there's also sorrow. It's not just levity, there's also gravity, right? I'll just give you one very brief example. When Aslan sacrifices himself in The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, and then he resurrects, right? There's a scene where Lucy and Susan are playing with him. And there's this beautiful passage that says, where Lucy says, I couldn't tell if it was more like playing with a kitten or playing with like a thunderstorm, right? It's this kind of numinous blend of levity, right? There's play, they're described as a heap of rolling laughter, right? So there's laughter. At the same time, Aslan brings something very heavy and very serious and something that is not to be trifled with, right?
Yeah.
And that's just one of many examples that I could give you of how Lewis takes this both and approach and says, listen, we need a theological imagination that integrates both the light side of life and the heavy, more tragic, dark side of life. And we need a vision of humanity and the gospel that brings them both together. So I think that speaks to this idea of integration that you were asking about.
Yeah, what an exceptional case of it. And I didn't realize that was your dissertation topic. Wonderful. I think right in that line is like you said, him holding this integrative, but not losing sight of these rich things that I think the best expressions of Christian theology have tried to communicate. This thread between the joyous end for which we're created, in which we do taste regularly through the gift of creation, even in its broken and fallenness, it gets through. And yet God, the fullness of joy itself is not simply just joyous, trivial things, but this kind of, like you said, it has this gravitas about it, that it's this complete kind of perfection of joy that allows for this kind of, I would often argue, a kind of freedom to, basically, I don't even know how to fully put it. I think I can match it in the ethical sphere. Lewis was someone who held together the notion that creation, our relation to creation as Christians, should be one that affirms both of these dimensions, that we are not fully purified in our loves. Therefore, there's always the temptation to turn the creature into an idol, and therefore there is an ascetic dimension. There is a kind of what I think Nietzsche would say at this point, a kind of, turning gray of things. But Lewis won't end there. He said the reason we do that is because there's a poison in this whole situation that needs to be kind of sucked out of us, if you will, in order for us to receive the real joy and fullness that is communicating itself and attractive, but we're receiving it the wrong way. And so in a sense, like Pilgrim's Regress, if you will, is the weaning of us off of our idols, right? I think he starts with right? He starts in Puritania. Is that how he put it? It's been a while since I read it. But he starts in there where you almost get this gray type of Christianity, right? The Puritan vision, but there is enough there to set him on this journey, right? Tasting something out there. And then he keeps tracing these kind of false infinites. And, this is where the regress. And so in a way, theology in terms of our spiritual life is this weaning us from those idols, but at the same time, our love's being purified not so that we can become dull, but actually so we can enact that joy and experience it more fully. Am I on the right track there?
I think you are. I mean, those are really, profound and beautiful insights about Lewis. And it just reminds me of two kind of passages in his writing. One is at the end of The Weight of Glory, right? Which, I mean, this is like, you have to memorize this. Like, this is one of the best sermons ever.
Yes.
But right at the end, he says, we have to play. We have to be merry and light. But our merriment is a new kind. It's the kind that's based on a kind of gravity, right? The gravity that I respect you as a human being. Yeah. And I'm not taking that for granted. And he says that it's only when we human beings respect each other fundamentally, sacramentally, right?
Yeah.
That it opens up a whole new kind of merriment that you couldn't have enjoyed otherwise, right?
Yeah.
And I don't know about you, but I experience this in my life personally. I find that the friendships that I enjoy the most, where I can be most free and just, encounter the joy of life, are friends that I have mutual respect with. I feel like they respect me as a person. I respect them as a person. And that makes life so much more enjoyable. And so I think Lewis is hitting on something really interesting there, which is that point that there has to be in your life a center of gravity, but that makes levity possible everywhere else.
Yeah.
Right. And a very beautiful, a very rich kind of levity, I think. So yeah, I think you're on the right track. I think that's really fascinating. And the other passages that comes to mind is when he wrote a preface to Pilgrim's Regress, several years after he published it.
Yeah.
He said that he used joy as a kind of lived ontological argument.
Huh.
This is really fascinating to me,
Yes,
right? Because the ontological argument says that you can derive God's being from his definition.
Yeah.
Right? You can derive the existence of God from the definition. And he says, it's really fascinating that he thinks of joy in this way, like real joy. And he says, listen, if you truly follow joy, like John does in Pilgrim's Regress, his vision of the island, every time you encounter what you're calling the false infinite, right?
Yeah.
An idol, it's going to shatter on you, and it's not going to deliver the promise of ultimate joy that attracted you to the idol in the first place. And he says the danger is settling for our idols, thinking that this is enough for me. But if you keep very careful attention to your desire, your ultimate desire, it's going to correct itself. It's auto-correcting. So the idols will shatter, but it'll point to the ultimate fulfillment, which we find in the ultimate infinite, right, which is God.
God, that's rich. I didn't know that about him doing that, a play on the ontological argument. My sense was that he's onto something like that. I mean, that's one of the things that kind of cued me into the notion of the weaning off of these idols and the pursuit of the real. And there is this kind of sense in our creatureliness that there is this frustrating aspect about us as fallen creatures that, like you said, we're made for this joy. We're called to it. Everything about our being cries out for it. And yet that fallenness in the world and in ourselves makes the idol seem attractive, and our longing for that joy compelled by that idol. And I mean, I know Augustine really had a lot of insights on this, different figures that I'm sure that Lewis cut his teeth on. But I think him turning it away from just the question of happiness, but this emphasis on joy is significant. There is a bit of a difference there. Is that worth parsing a little bit? The difference between maybe the classic tradition of, eudaimonism, just pursuit of happiness, versus this emphasis on joy.
Yeah, I think that's really good. I met with Stuart Gertz recently, who's another C.S. Lewis scholar, and I think he would maybe disagree with me on this issue. Yeah. He would be a great person to have on the show, actually, because he thinks that the primary category for Lewis is happiness, right? That's the real category. I argue that in Surprised by Joy, he makes it very clear that the only thing happiness and joy have in common is that you would want them both again. But qualitatively, Sehnsucht, which is his term for joy,
that's right.
It's very different. It's very different. It's almost a kind of grief, but it's a kind of grief that you want again, right? Yeah. It's a kind of emptiness that is more satisfying than any fullness the world can offer, right? Yeah. So I think it's very important. And I think if we don't distinguish happiness from joy, it can lead us into kind of messy situations where we do settle for those idols that you were talking about. Yes. Because it makes me happy. Right? Yeah. Oh, having money makes me happy. So maybe this is it. Maybe this is all that there is to life, right? Oh, all these other things, right? Material things make me happy. Maybe this is the ultimate happiness. And when you make space for joy, you get to see, oh no, there's more to the picture. Yeah. So personally, I think that's true. I think it's very important. And practically, I also think Lewis believes that self-reflection or introspection is not the way to test whether you are joyful. This is very important. Wow. So part of his critique of Freudianism is that it over-relies on introspection, that if you just turn your mind's eye inward, you'll find all these repressed things and all these horrible shadows lurking. And Lewis tried to experiment with this when he was in Cherbourg school, and he was praying. And he said, well, I'm not going to stop praying until I have this introspective realization that like God has heard me or something. And he said it ruined his experience of prayer. It ruined his experience of God. And I think this is part of what led him to abandon his Christian faith that he grew up in, was this kind of over-reliance on introspection.
Yeah.
So this is very important, because some people, they might think, okay, well, how do I know when I'm joyful as opposed to happy, right? Well, let me just introspect. Let me just kind of reflect on myself.
Yeah.
And Lewis thinks that that's not a reliable method to test whether you're joyful or not. And I don't know about you, but I could be having a great time, right? I could be, I took my mom, actually. She's a great mom. I love her. Joanna, if you're out there, shout out to you.
She is special. She was one of my students once upon it. That's how I was introduced to you.
Yeah,
yes, she was in my class at Gordon Conwell.
I was going to ask you that. But my mom treated us, me, my dad, my brother-in-law, to golf for Father's Day. This Father's Day that just passed by, and it was a wonderful time. Like I was really, happy and joyful. But if you would have stopped me while I was playing golf and said, "Oh, Jahdiel, are you having a good time?" Yeah, I'm having a great time. Right? Are you happy right now? It's like, okay, well, let me think. Right? Let me think a little bit. Yeah, I'm happy. I'm really happy. But are you joyful? Then it's like you start to question yourself. You're like, maybe. Yeah, I think I am joyful. But are you ecstatic? And then you're like, okay. So then you start to feel bad that you don't have like the ultimate descriptor. And that's part of the problem, right? So Lewis would say, listen, joy is not in your control. It's when you are just immersed in a God-given activity that points beyond itself. And you're so immersed in it that you're not out of reflecting, you're not thinking about yourself, you're not asking yourself questions, is this joy, right? No. Like joy when it happens to you and when it overcomes you, right? So this is just speaking to the question you raised about what is at stake if we don't distinguish between happiness and joy.
It's rich on a lot of levels, and that I think will help our audience a lot in some of these qualifications that I think sometimes get missed by people because some of the language is very similar and some of the debates get very thick. But an interesting thing you mentioned in there in unpacking that was this notion that his real intense introspective brought almost a ruin to himself. And I tend to think in the modern world in particular, where people are trying to find out who their true selves are through this introspective sense of do my feelings, connect with some self-interpretation. And I think sometimes that is a similar tradition to what Lewis is wrestling with on the spiritual train there that leads to kind of self-ruin. And I think it's very important because you're moving now into kind of a participation in something that we're created for, but we're not in control of, or the ones that are the final meaning of whether or not I am participating in it. Rather, it's almost it's an opening up of us spiritually to seeing where we sit in relationship to God as joy himself, if you will.
Love that insight that you just raised. I absolutely love it. I think it's correct that this applies to our context now, where you're almost expected to use introspection to establish and affirm your identity, right?
Yeah.
What you are, who you are, that you know yourself best, that nobody knows you better than you, so you can tell the world what you are. Lewis is just like, Lewis is like, I'm calling that bluff, right? Like there's no way. And part of his view is that your true personality is awaiting you in the Trinity, in God, right? Your true personality is waiting for you. And I think this is such a powerful insight. And I personally, I think our value of authenticity and genuineness is kind of overrated
Yeah.
A little bit.
Yes.
The idea that like everything has to be original, and if the only way I could love my wife is if I feel genuinely like loving her. I'm celebrating 9 years of my anniversary today, and I would have not made it this far if I just said, oh, I'm just gonna love her when I genuinely, authentically feel like it.
Yeah.
No, right? No, and part of what Lewis picks up on in Mere Christianity is precisely the power of acting as if, right? Josephine Gableman, which I really highly recommend her book, Theology of Nonsense. It's a really brilliant book. She brings out this idea that divine make-believe is actually essential to Christian spirituality. That even faith, the definition of faith in Hebrews 11, right? It's acting, thinking as if the unseen world were seen. It's almost a kind of playing, a kind of pretending almost, that's really powerful. And Lewis says this is how we become more Christ-like, right?
Yeah.
Stop worrying whether you're in fact actually authentically loving, and just act as if, right?
As if,
love on your neighbor, and the love will grow, right?
Yeah.
So I think that's a beautiful point. And I think Lewis can be a corrective here, where instead of just over relying on our introspection, which we can be so wrong about that. You know, what if our true personalities, what if our true identities were waiting for us in our Creator?
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
Maybe that's a better approach to think about it. And I find that incredibly soul nourishing.
Yeah, it is. I mean, it's very biblical. I mean, at the top, you know, we don't even know who we truly are yet. We wait until his appearing. Then we will see, you know, who we are as we see him. And there is something, I think, very liberating there. And there's a recognition of that we're premised, right? That we are made for this and our fulfillment is in it. And we don't bear the burden of having to actualize it or realize it. We get to free. This is where true freedom sits. Truthfully enacting our creatureliness, is a way of putting it. There's so much here. I think one of the things that comes to mind when you mention this is I have a lot of respect for Charles Taylor, the kind of social philosopher, and I think one of the things that was insightful is his locating of kind of as everything became enframed within the immanent, right? As everything became basically locked within the this worldly completely. This notion of authenticity became a sort of a secularized version of a Christian view of things. But what is rich about Lewis is he saw where that could go if we ran with it and didn't qualify it with a richer Christian vision. Glenn.
My internet went down completely. Then I tried multiple ways of reconnecting. I reset everything. It didn't. Well, I'm back.
Well, we're sorry you missed some of the rich conversation, but we were just talking about at the moment the rich understanding of the human person that C.S. Lewis had. We talked a lot about the difference between joy and happiness, and maybe different ways of parsing that. And I think our last point was that we were talking about just the way in which the modern concept of the human being oftentimes tries to draw itself by being authentic and being original, and it uses introspection as a way of kind of validating what is true about our identity and self versus not, and how this early in Lewis's life may have caused a kind of faith crisis. And it was really freeing himself from that in many ways that he was able to communicate, I think, a much richer vision. Jahdiel, I'll let you maybe summarize the point better. I know we have just about 10 minutes, but maybe this will be a good way to the next point.
Yeah, this has been a wonderful conversation. And our latest point was about how contemporary people nowadays think that they can turn their mind's eye inward and discover who they really are authentically. And Lewis, I think, showed the kind of problems with introspection. And even in Surprised by Joy, he says that part of what led him to be severely disappointed with his Christian faith was how he felt that his prayer life was really frustrating. And he committed to praying every night. He would not stop praying until he had this feeling of realization. And the way that he could detect that is through introspection. But he felt that that means the prayers would drag on. He felt very frustrated with the spiritual life. He felt like maybe this whole practice is just kind of soul sucking for him. And I think that that's part of what set him up for the leaving his faith, basically.
I think Glenn disappeared again. It's all
right.
good. It's all good.
It'll be Tom and Jahdiel today. Yeah.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. Yeah, well, that is very interesting. And the other point I was thinking about when you mentioned that is right at this time, of course, the Freudian psychological analysis of faith and kind of as being a certain kind of, another way of defining ourselves immanently. But this was connected, I think, also to Feuerbach. Feuerbach's big notion that this notion of desire that we have is really desire for God is just a projection onto a big screen. And Lewis is trying to avoid that, and he's very careful with that. It's a very careful argument of not lending itself to Freud or Feuerbach, but really communicating something else. Is again, I'm going off of how I've been kind of understanding what you've been saying. So I hope I'm on the right track there.
No, I think you are. Yeah, I think he's responding to Feuerbach, to what Paul Ricoeur called the masters of suspicion, right? Marx, Nietzsche, and Freud. And they all assume the same thing, that there is no God and we're just projecting our need out onto the universe, right? And this is just not. Lewis exposes this and says, listen, you're begging the question. You're assuming there's no God and then creating this really interesting story of how we blundered into this mistake. That's a logical fallacy, right? Yeah. This is where he draws on his philosophical training. That's a logical fallacy. The first and most important question is there a God, right? What does it mean to believe in God? Because if there is, this whole narrative of projection can be interesting sociologically, but not as a kind of undermining of belief in God, right? So he's basically saying, listen, we have to return to the first things, which is if there is a God, we're not projecting, right? If there is no God, then we are projecting. But we can't just assume one way or another and kind of bypass dialogue and discussion.
Yeah, that's a powerful thing at that time. I think a lot of theologians tried to avoid it. I mean, I know that with Karl Barth, he would force his students to read Feuerbach before he went into it, but his way of approaching it, I think, added more complications and problems. And I think Lewis much more richer on that. Glenn, we have a few minutes with him. Did you want to throw out any kind of specific question you may have had, or I'll let him run with a last point?
I think given that how unstable my internet has been and how much I've missed, I'm probably best keeping my mouth shut at this point, and I'll let him have the last point here. Sorry about that.
Well, we have a few minutes. Maybe a last point you want to share, something maybe you're working on or we didn't get to cover, and we'd love to have you back. This conversation is definitely rich, and I know our audience will love it. Or just something you'd encourage our audience to do with Lewis.
Sure, thank you. I just want to thank you for having me, on the show. This was such an easy conversation to have with you. My message to the listeners would be, if you are really interested in Lewis, if he has impacted you in a profound way, there are opportunities now to study Lewis like never before. And it's a really exciting, moment in the development of Lewis studies. I think there's still a lot to explore. There's still a lot that can be teased out from Lewis's writings. So if you've been impacted by his writings, if you feel like you could take this to the next level, I would just encourage you to actually look, well, what would studying Lewis more seriously, more formally look like? Alistair McGrath is I believe he retired, but he's still a great person to reach out to on who would be available. There's still a lot of people. Michael Ward is an expert on C.S. Lewis. Those are my advisors at Oxford, but now is a great time to press into Lewis studies if that's what you're passionate about. And I'm saying that as someone who, when I was coming out of Harvard Divinity School, and considering what to do for doctoral work, I had one professor who told me, don't do Lewis. Very clearly, don't do Lewis. And he said it out of a place of love. He said, listen, nobody takes Lewis seriously. If you do research on Lewis, no one's going to take you seriously. He said, find a more serious philosopher or theologian to study. That got me a little sad, but yeah. I ran into another professor at Harvard, and he told me the opposite. He said, listen, follow what you love. Not everybody has to write theology systematically. Like, not everybody has to write like Bart, he told me. And just study what you love. And I feel like God honors that when you do that. So yeah, I would just encourage anybody interested in studying Lewis to go for it.
That's great. Yeah, we had Michael on a few weeks ago. We did a little tour back of Oxford. My first time back in 16 years, so it was lovely to go back. We had him and Professor McGrath as well. So yeah, we got to see your two super doctoral supervisors there. So very nice. So it's nice to top it off with you. I think this is the last of our kind of Lewis discussions, wrapping up that whole series, and we do have a little documentary coming out. But anyway, thank you all for listening. This has been a wonderful conversation. It was sad to see Glenn come in and out, because we would have loved to have that stream stay steady. But it's been a rich conversation. We'd love to have Jahdiel back again in the near future. And anyway, thanks for listening, and bye-bye. Bye.
The Theology Pugcast is a ministry of Trinity Reformed Church in Huntsville, Alabama. To learn more about the church, you can visit trinityreformedkirk.com. trinityreformedkirk.com.